The 1,100-mile California coastline provides the backdrop to California's envied lifestyle. It is the central attraction for the state's $50 billion a year travel and tourism industry.
The sand, the sun, the children, dogs, and surfers on the beach, the remarkable feel of leisure give little hint to the battles that have gone on to protect this coastline. One reason is because, as rich as California is in wide sandy beaches and mild climate, it is also rich in coastal oil reserves, especially here along the Santa Barbara Channel.
Unknown to most, oil and gas development has taken place along this coast for more than 100 years. The first offshore oil wells were drilled at the end of piers, off Summerlin, just south of Santa Barbara, in the late 1800s. Bob Solon, retired Santa Barbara News Press reporter and author of An Ocean of Oil, a century of political struggle over petroleum off the California coast, shows us a spot near Carpinteria where some of this development has taken place.
The industry went offshore in 1896 when they put drilling rigs on the end of lumber piers off Summerlin and Carpinteria. Those were the first offshore oil wells in the world. And from the very day, and I mean from the very day in terms of 24 hours, the protest has been uninterrupted. The industry was a mess. They put rigs on these wooden piers, and the wooden piers weren't built for that, and the industry didn't much care as long as they could get some oil up. It was a mess, and it continued to be down through the years. There was no regulation of offshore oil drilling because there was no offshore oil drilling until that time. And since then, the public agencies, state and federal, have been trying to keep up with an oil industry that comes up with something new every year. Then you've got to have a new regulation for it. But it never caught up. And from that day on, Santa Barbara coastal residents were up in arms against the oil industry.
Residents and elected officials in Santa Barbara County had seen the effects of oil's boom and bust cycles on their local economy for decades. Valuing the unparalleled beauty of their corner of the world, they fought hard to prevent a new wave of efforts to exploit oil reserves that began in the 1960s. President Johnson's Interior Department, looking for ways to finance the war in Vietnam, auctioned off oil leasing rights in the Santa Barbara Channel. The bids submitted amounted to nearly $1.3 billion. Drilling commenced almost immediately.
I could see the thing coming because there was a rush and there were inadequate regulations.
In 1968, Union Oil acted as the operator for a coalition of 4 companies that bid a record-setting $61.4 million for one lease tract.
They definitely, do try to cut corners. That's what happened with the 1969 oil spill. Unocal convinced the federal government to allow them not to install casings all the way down the level that they were going to drill. And what happened is there was a blowout below where they installed the casings. Now, had they installed the full casings, the blowout probably wouldn't have happened.
Union Oil's cost-cutting measure proved to be a tragic mistake. The worst of Santa Barbarans' fears were realized on January 28, 1969, when a blowout occurred at Platform A, shattering the fragile caprock on the ocean floor and allowing massive amounts of oil to begin bubbling into the water and drifting ashore. There was an attempt to keep it quiet.
The only people who knew about it were the people that were on the platform at the time.
The next day, no one ashore had yet been informed when Bob Solon received a phone call at his desk at the Santa Barbara News Press.
Late in the morning, we got a call, and it was a male voice. It said, "The ocean is boiling around platform A." And I started to ask questions, and this person said, "The ocean is boiling around platform A, goodbye." And I don't know to this day who that person was.
We woke up that morning and it smelled like tar, and went outside. I thought someone perhaps was tarring the road, but they weren't, and soon enough neighbors started to gather also and ask what was going on, and someone tuned in to the local radio news and discovered there'd been an oil spill down at the beach. So we all went down there like lemmings. The community just started pouring out onto the beach, and what we found was shocking. The oil kept coming. It was very heavy, black. In time, the water was all black. The ocean was dead. It was an incredible sight.
Mr. Sathry, here we are at Santa Barbara's once beautiful harbor. How serious is the oil situation?
It has really deteriorated. It's a bad situation. It's a complete mess throughout the marinas, and has affected every boat in the harbor.
How bad is it, Mr. Sathry, as far as facilities at the harbor here and the yachts that are tied up in the other watercraft?
Well, every one of them have been affected. They've all got oil on them. They all need to be cleaned, and there's some paint damage. All of our marinas, the facilities themselves, are coated with this thick, oozy oil, and it's going to take a long time to clean this mess up.
You think the harbor will ever get back to its original state?
Oh, I'm sure that it will be cleaned up eventually. Of course, they've got to stop that oil flow out there at the wells before there's much that can be done here.
The event ruptured the bottom of the ocean, what we call the cap rock, which was very fragile. And that's when the oil and the gas escaped. And how do you control anything like that? Offshore Santa Barbara area, there are natural seeps that have been going on for nobody knows how long. Mm-hmm. Again, it's oil and gas accumulation under the bottom of the ocean, and not enough cap rock to really contain it. The ocean bottom was fragmented, and it was uncontrolled. So all you could do was wait till it came to the beach and then clean it up. And the high-tech technique at that time was straw. Dump straw on the beach and then pick up the straw, which absorbed the oil. And that went on for weeks.
It wasn't just local residents who were horrified by photos that showed how the oil spill blackened the beach and resulted in the death of thousands of birds, fish, and marine mammals.
It was one tragic scene of a bird, and a vehicle had run across it, and it was saturated with oil, obviously dead. And we called it the picture that went around the world because we put it on the I guess it was AP wires. And it was picked up and it was seen in newspapers all over the world. But the news press ran a little box on page 1 every day. Oil spill in its 310th day. When will it end?
The president of Union Oil issued the statement, "I don't like to call it a disaster because there's been no loss of human life. I'm amazed at the publicity for the loss of a few birds."
Well, we don't know how many birds there were. We don't know how many marine mammals were affected. marine life and shorebird life was seriously affected. But, well, Union Oil looked at it that way. I can't say Santa Barbara did, because there were more people volunteering to go out and try and clean oil off the birds than for anything. Old Guard groups like Audubon and Sierra Club became very active. New groups like Community Environmental Council, the Environmental Defense Center.
And it was because of all the organizations that formed in response to the 1969 oil spill, as well as all of the federal and state laws that came into play, that led to the local communities realizing that they needed some help on the legal front to be able to force agencies to do the right thing, to try to stop disastrous activities that would affect the coast. And that's actually why the Environmental Defense Center was formed. We were formed to help all the other environmental groups, from the Sierra Club to Get Oil Out and Audubon Society and Surfrider, to help them have the tools to try to block more damaging offshore oil and gas development.
It would be a year before the oil stopped oozing from the hole in the ocean floor. Years before tourists would begin returning and fishing would begin to recover. And decades before beach visitors could leave the beach without tar on their feet.
What no one would have expected was that the positive effects of the oil spill would last longer than the negative.
It was called the environmental shot heard round the world because we suddenly became aware of the perils to our environment by these kinds of things. And then the chairman of the board of Union Oil, just tried to fluff it off, and then that made people madder, and pretty soon you had a sense of rage by the people that their coast wasn't being looked after.
The oil spill helped create the public pressure that caused Congress to pass and see signed into law by Richard Nixon the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and the National Environmental Protection Act.
It contributed to the public outcry that resulted in the first Earth Day in 1970. But federal legislation to protect water quality was not enough to satisfy Californians who wanted to see that their coastline was protected from intensive development. For several years, they had already been working to draft and pass legislation to protect their coastline.
Virtually every bit of beach had plans for it, and developers wanted to have Miami Beach as the example, and what was being brought to city councils was, we can make this just like Miami Beach.
We tried a bill both starting on the Senate side and the Assembly side, and the Coastal Alliance made it clear that if these bills failed, they would go to the initiative. So since we couldn't get a bill through, the Senate bill died, the Assembly bill made it over to the Senate, but we couldn't get it out there. And then we were way ahead until the last few weeks.
Fortunately, we had a celebration that November in 1972, and the measure passed with 55% of the vote. So we weren't at all sure what the outcome would be. And many people worked very, very hard to make that happen.
The moratorium that is in place now was put in place partly by the administration and partly by the Congress. And it was interesting that the people who enacted the first moratorium, there were state and federal ones, were not all liberal legislators, but the public response, the public opposition to oil development offshore was so strong that not even conservative legislators could resist it. And that's how the moratoriums first came into being. Now there are, and that was quite some time ago, shortly after 1970.
Though oil platforms built in the 60s continue to pump oil from beneath the Santa Barbara Channel, as well as in other locations along the California coast, the Coastal Act and the Coastal Commission have helped stave off further development of offshore oil and gas leases.
And while I was on the Coastal Commission, we took the step of suing the federal government to perfect California's ability to review the environmental plans that any particular offshore oil development or lease development would submit. We didn't have that, but I'm proud to say that while we were on the Coastal Commission, we took up that fight and we were successful. We do not think that any value that might be obtained from additional offshore oil drilling is worth the risk. If you take a look at the oil that's in the Santa Barbara Channel, it's asphalt grade crude. Mineral Management acknowledges it's asphalt grade crude. I don't really think that we ever want to jeopardize the $50 billion coastal related tourism industry and other kinds of business that are clean businesses that benefit the people of California in exchange for a very, very small window of petroleum that's out there that isn't even available for automobile use.
Coastal oil drilling, whether offshore or onshore, is inherently polluting. Oil spills must be expected.
You know, I think any oil company, their bottom line is to extract the resource and produce it and, you know, get it to the market. And in any of that, there are going to be consequences locally. And I think even the best intentioned oil company is still going to, you know, be proposing an activity that is still going to have risks to the coast. No matter how hard a company tries to prevent an oil spill, they still happen. We just had a major oil spill off of our coast in 1997 when a pipeline that was bringing oil from Platform Irene off of the Point Arguello coast sprung a leak. Now, the automatic leak detection system in the pipeline worked. The technology worked. The pipeline was shut down. The spill only would have lasted for a few seconds, but an operator on the platform said, "Oh my gosh, the pipeline shut down, I better restart it." And he restarted it, and it ended up spilling for several hours before anyone detected it. So, you know, even though the company tried to use good technology, you never know once, you know, operations are in play what's going to happen. And almost all oil spills tend to be exacerbated, if not caused, by operator error. There's constant issues with air pollution and oil spills and water pollution from these types of activities, and they just can't avoid them.
Residents of Oxnard and Port Hueneme, at the opposite end of the Santa Barbara Channel, have made repeated attempts to prevent gas-related projects.
In the early 70s came the first attempt to convert the Ormond Beach wetlands, located between the Port Hueneme Pier and the Point Mugu Naval Station boundary, to an onshore facility for liquefied natural gas, or LNG as it is now commonly called.
There were plans that were developed by Southern California Edison to convert really what was remaining of the wetlands to an LNG facility. And so that was one of the first real big environmental battles in Ventura County as people saw the environmental impact report, which was one of the first done after the California Environmental Quality Act was passed. And it identified that should there be a problem, that there was a safety hazard that could result in harm and possibly death to thousands of residents in Port Hueneme and Oxnard.
A study was then commissioned by the newly implemented California Coastal Commission. The study found that the only safe place for an onshore LNG facility would be at Point Conception, where there was no population center. As a result, a proposal for an LNG facility at Point Conception was rapidly forthcoming. The lawsuit that ensued brought together an unusual group of plaintiffs.
My group, which at that time was Friends of the Earth, that was an opponent, and as was Hollister Ranch, which was whose land would be taken, and because it was a Native American graveyard, AIM was involved.
One of our very first cases in the late 70s involved opposing a proposed liquefied natural gas project offshore Point Conception. Our client was the Chumash Nation up in Santa Barbara County. At that time, we were told we had a huge natural gas crisis in California. If we didn't bring in natural gas from overseas, what were we going to do? The lights were going to go out.
When the court ruled in favor of the defendants, it looked as though the LNG facility would be built. Then a drop in the price of natural gas made the project economically unfeasible. And thus, the first phase of West Coast LNG facility planning ended. In 2002, a surprisingly swift chain of events decided the fate of a second onshore LNG proposal, again planned for Ormond Beach. Fortunately, a first right of refusal clause resulted in the purchase by the state of California of the first major parcel of land at Ormond Beach.
We have ended up being the custodians of some wetland mitigation funds from San Onofre, in fact. And early on, Southern California Edison had asked us if we would like to have a large chunk of Ormond Beach for restoration as a settlement. And there were a lot of reasons, mostly having to do with liability for a lot of waste problems that are up there that led us not to do that. But we did maintain right of first refusal, and so we got a phone call saying, well, the time has come, and someone's looking to buy this land. And I said, gee, who is that? And I said, well, it's Occidental that wants to put an LNG facility there. And so we said, well, that sounds like we better step up. And I should say also, we were just came up with a third of the price, $9.7 million, and we came up a little over $3 million. And the Coastal Conservancy put together the rest of that, so it wasn't us by ourselves.
And thus, the second phase of LNG planning at Ormond Beach ended.
The 2-mile stretch called Ormond Beach is home to 9 protected species, and its natural sand dunes have been one of the few public places in Southern California where the endangered California least tern and the threatened western snowy plover have been able to successfully nest in the past 10 years. Ormond Beach activists had barely managed to fight off a proposal for a vehicle processing plant on adjacent land when the first of 3 proposals for offshore LNG facilities was filed in the summer of 2003.
At the time this documentary is being finished, no LNG facilities have been permitted for California. And the citizens of California are poised to fight the permitting in court if it should occur. Oil and gas issues are only one set of challenges facing the California coast today. Other issues include beach erosion, so-called armoring of the coast, and potential development of some of the few large remaining tracts of oceanfront property, including Hearst Ranch and the Gaviota Coast.
The success of coastal protection over the past 35 years shows in what you don't see along the coast. There are still wetlands where marinas were planned, and there's open space where high-rise hotels would have been built. There are gates and signs in the middle of Malibu to provide access to the beach.
That coastline is precious. We have 1,100 miles of California coastline. Over 80% of California's population lives within an hour of the beach. That's a public resource. It belongs to every Californian. They have a right to have access to it. They have a right to enjoy it. And I don't think it ought to be spoiled by some short-term thinking about dependence on petroleum.
But the coast hasn't stayed the way it is by accident, and it won't stay that way in the future without unrelenting political will to keep it a natural resource available to all. If the California coast is important to you, remember that it depends on voters who vote the coast and the willingness of communities to provide the financial and volunteer support required to maintain coastal activism.
The coast is never saved. It's always being saved.
It's never really won. We are always in the process of getting there and making it happen.